Thanks, John, for that great introduction to the topic. Our four panelists for today are Brian Ray, Associate Professor in the Department of Geography from the University of Ottawa, Vicki Esses from the University of Western Ontario, who's also the co-chair of the WCI. She's sitting in for Valerian, who was unable to join us today. Don Elmore, Chair of the Diversity Advisory Committee at Algoma University, and finally Scott Fisher, Coordinator from the Growth and Development Department at the City of Greater Sudbury, also the Coordinator of the LEP. I think we'll begin with Brian.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here today and giving me the opportunity to talk about a project that I was involved in when I worked in the United States. So I'm going to be talking about a situation in the United States, which you might go, what in the world does that have to do with North Bay or Northern Ontario? But I was involved in a project called Building the New American Community that essentially looked at how to develop an integration mechanism for cities that had a relatively weak history of recent immigration, but had expressed an interest in immigration issues. So like many communities across the north, the communities that I was involved in were dealing with immigration as a relatively new phenomenon and something that they were trying to grapple with in many cases in different ways. So instead of talking about New York or Chicago, I'm going to be talking about those great immigrant destination cities of Nashville, Tennessee, Lowell, Massachusetts, and Portland, Oregon. I know they would all come straight to your mind right off the top. These cities were strategically selected because in many cases, in the case of Nashville and Portland, they were experiencing a very strong increase in the number of immigrants living in their cities. So in the case of Nashville, there had been over a 200% increase in the foreign-born population in 10 years. So huge change there. Lowell, Massachusetts, on the other hand, a relatively slow-growth industrial city, was looking to retain and attract immigrants. So a little bit different situation in each city. The cities did share some things in common. First of all, funding. In the United States, there is no federal or state dollars for immigrant integration programs. So they were all dealing with a context in which there was no money. And all of these cities were in states where social services for immigrants were among the poorest of all 50 states in the United States. So people weren't going there because social welfare was really great. All of the cities were very diverse in terms of the immigrant communities that were there, the new immigrant communities that were there, and each of the communities were dealing with some degree of discomfort or hostility with regard to the changes that were happening within the community. They also had a number of assets, and one of the assets that all three communities had was interest on the part of mainstream organizations in addressing issues that were coming about because of the changing composition of the immigrant community within each of the cities. So in each of the cities there was a coalition of organizations that were very diverse, some private, a lot of them private, some public institutions that were really interested in trying to look at the challenges and opportunities associated with cultural and demographic change. Usually we saw public and private partnerships between social services, education, business development, and in most of the cities there was an interest by private employers in the coalitions as well, and in the case of Nashville, the coalition was led by the Chamber of Commerce. So there was a great deal of interest in the issue of demographic change and what could happen. So what did we learn? In terms of the mainstream organizations, they were often very well aware of the degree to which their cities were changing, the need to respond to that change, the need to develop a coalition that was effective in dealing with those changes. So there was a great deal of goodwill, but it was often difficult to take that goodwill and translate it into practices that actually made a difference. And why? So why? The first reason is that some organizations found it very difficult to gather information about the newcomer communities that would allow them to adapt their processes in a way that would actually serve newcomer communities. So it was difficult to gain information that was useful and effective. It was also difficult for many organizations to learn about how particular practices or processes or programs were delivered in the countries from which immigrants came. And this was magnified by the fact that immigrants didn't just come from Italy, they came from all over the world. And practices in terms of delivering services are different from country to country. So it made it very challenging for mainstream organizations to figure out both what they needed and how things were done in the places from which they came. And this created great opportunities for misunderstanding or a sense among immigrant organizations, or among immigrants, that mainstream organizations don't respond to their needs. And it was a very challenging thing to work with. There was also strong rigidity in many mainstream organizations to make substantial changes, in part because although the demographics of the larger community were shifting, they weren't shifting to such a significant degree that there were in fact large proportions of individuals who were actually calling for changes to be made in that organization. So yes, the organization may now be serving 20% of its clientele may be coming from a newcomer community or newcomer communities, but 80% is still the same old clientele that had been there for the last 20 years. And it was very difficult to convince organizations to make changes that would help the minority rather than the majority. So those are a couple of the lessons that were kind of negative lessons that were learned. Let me turn to more positive lessons that were learned. One of the more successful initiatives that we saw in many of the new destination communities were in terms of building trust between mainstream organizations and immigrant communities, in which a lot of learning went on for the part of mainstream organizations. And let me use one example. In a number of communities, there were challenges around policing. And both police and municipal authorities had a great deal of difficulty understanding why a community behaved in a particular way, and there was a lot of tension and distrust, often between the police force and the newcomer communities. And thanks to a philanthropic organization, a program was set up that took police chiefs and municipal council representatives and school trustees to places where a large number of immigrants who are now living in their community actually came from. And it created a great deal of learning on the part of why particular communities behaved in the way they did. These police officers, council members, school trustees came back to their communities in the United States and became absolutely terrific advocates and spokespeople for explaining and advocating for their communities. And it was a wonderfully successful thing. They were particularly effective in dealing with the media. Finally, something else that worked was a labor shortage. And one mainstream organization that really responded well to labor shortage were employers. And so we saw a lot of innovation from employers as mainstream organizations in terms of providing things that retained both workers and immigrants in their community. So things like language classes on site in the places where people were working, and a great deal of attention on the part of some employers to not only employ one adult in the family, but to employ or find ways of employing two adults in a family. If you employ two people in a household, you're more likely to retain that family, and it was extremely effective and worthwhile. The last thing I'll point to is media training for both immigrant organizations that were often very poorly resourced, as well as many mainstream organizations. Doing media training and allowing them to be really good spokespeople to the local media went a long way in terms of creating a more integrative environment in these cities. And
Okay, so I'm just stepping in for Valerian Murchko, who unfortunately has the flu and wasn't able to make it today. I'm not going to be talking about health services in particular, although I will touch on health services. What I want to talk about, and I don't want to step on Don's toes, so I'm not going to be talking about international students. I'm going to be talking about the university as a very mainstream organization, which is a rich resource for communities, and I don't think has been utilized to the extent that it can be. So, you know, historically universities have really been semi-isolated in their communities. Students come even from out of town to those universities. They live in the universities, they stay there. They don't really interact with their communities. I'd say this is a really interesting time because if you look at the strategic plans of many universities today, one of the issues that is mentioned is becoming better connected to the community and giving back to the community. So universities are now primed to be doing more work in the community and to connect to communities. They often don't know how. And I'd say this is a great opportunity for us and for northern communities because it's a resource that the communities can utilize in a lot of ways. So I want to talk about three things. One is communication. So in order to connect universities to communities, there has to be a mechanism for communication. And so I'm going to give examples from what we've done in London, Ontario, that I think are really easily transferable to other locations. And one thing we have done is set up something we call a local advisory committee. We meet once a month. It includes representatives from the university from a variety of disciplines. And then it includes representatives from the community. So in London, it includes somebody from the City of London, from the United Way, from the Cross-Cultural Learner Centre, which is our largest settlement organization, and from the Thames Valley District School Board. Pretty broad representation from the university, people in a variety of different disciplines. And we talk about our needs, what's going on, what's new, and our needs. And you know what, it's really important in terms of getting us to talk to each other about what we need and what the community needs. And this has led to some initiatives such as bringing in community representatives to talk to students about what their research needs are. So we've had, for example, the director of the Cross-Cultural Learner Centre come in and talk to our students about the research that the community needs or that the centre needs. And you know what, our students are looking for projects, right? They're looking for thesis topics, they're looking for projects, they're looking for independent studies. Here's an opportunity for them, and really it's a nice partnership. So that presentation actually initiated several projects. We also had our lead from the London Lit come in and talk about what are some of the priorities for the London Lit. The London Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership. And again, we've had students volunteer to start getting involved in some of those projects. Very nice connection, but you got to start with the communication. And I'd say sitting down very informally, you know, once a month to talk about what are the issues that are important doesn't cost anybody anything except for time. Okay, so what else is developed out of this? Out of this has also developed the fact that now the university actually has a representative on the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership who sits on the Central Council. Right now it's me, eventually it will be somebody else who sits on the Central Council and is the research person, so that when questions come up at LIT meetings, at our Central Council meetings about, you know, are there data on this issue? If I know, I'll say, or if I don't know, I go back and look for those data. And if there aren't data, I say, well, you know, maybe we could help you collect those data. So the idea is that the LIPs really have a built-in research component. They're supposed to be gauging outcomes as we move along, and having the university involved in that, again, is a really, I would say, easy way of managing that. So we communicate very well now. We tell each other about what's going on. I would say we've kind of gotten used to each other, so it's not only the case that the community has told us about their research needs, we've told the community about what our needs are. So for example, students start projects at certain times a year. You can't come to us, you know, in January, for example, and say, you know, we have this year-long project. It's not going to work for a thesis student who, you know, starts in September, finishes in March. So the community has now gotten used to sort of our timelines and what our students are able to do. So really there is a give and take on this. This has kind of evolved over time, and so the final thing I want to talk about, which I think Valerian was going to talk about a bit, was healthcare. And so we have a clinical psychology program at the university. Our clinical psychology program this year decided that the retreat, the one-day retreat that they were going to have was going to be on mental health needs of immigrants. Okay, what are the needs of a culturally diverse community? And it was a one-day event, brought in speakers to talk about these needs, and you know, this was really student-led because the students in our program, in the clinical psychology program, said, you know what, you don't give us enough of this, and we would like to know more about this. So we had this one-day event, but we didn't only have this one-day event. Out of this, actually, came a proposal that actually the Cross-Cultural Learner Center really needs to be providing some sort of mental health services or mental health counseling for newcomers. They're not mandated to do that, but the clinical psychology program actually does placements for students, or students do internships. So they've just written a proposal in which they'll bring in a student who will be under supervision one day a week. I don't know if this program has been approved yet, but I think it has a good chance that the student will be working there one day a week providing some sort of mental health services. Again, everybody benefits. So I guess the message I'm trying to convey is that the university is a very rich resource. It provides research opportunities. You know, I've heard people talking over the course of the last couple of days about bringing in consultants to do research. The universities are in your communities, they know your communities, and really they should be the people who you are bringing on board to do some of this research and to partner on the research, so that it's not being somebody coming in from outside doing the research and leaving again, but somebody who is part of that community doing that work. And then out of these experiences, I would say other things develop, like this proposal for mental health services, which never would have happened if we haven't really developed this communication. So,
everyone hear me okay? Thank you, Vicki. That was an excellent segue into what I'm going to speak to, and I definitely agree that partnerships with between the community organizations and the university can be very, very valuable. My name is Dawn Elmore, and I work at Algoma University, which is in Sault Ste. Marie, and I'm the chair of the university's Diversity Advisory Committee. And what I'm going to speak to today will be about two things. One will be about understand the university's efforts to understand the perspectives of our international students and also our students who are visible minorities and may have diverse backgrounds, and their interactions with mainstream organizations in the community. And then I will also speak to the university as a mainstream organization in and of itself, and some of the research that we've done surrounding that, and some of the initiatives that have worked, and some of the work that needs to be done. So just to give a little bit of background, Algoma is a very, very small university. We're the smallest university in the province. And up until the late 90s, we had no international students. We had very few as we moved into 2000, 2001. And we've been building the population of international students. Now we hover around 100. It goes up and down every year. Our Diversity Advisory Committee has existed since 2006. And it's not a student-led committee, it's a very top-down, administratively driven committee that is advisory to the president. So the committee reports directly to the president, and it provides him with advice on policies, procedures, cultural events, and support services. And it also provides a safe place for students, staff, and faculty to come to speak about diversity issues. The committee was formed unfortunately, as many of these sorts of initiatives are, in response to a series of unfortunate incidents that happened with Algoma University students interacting with mainstream organizations in the community in a way that was not so positive. And the university tried to step up and create a way that we could start addressing some of these issues. The committee is not limited to considering diversity based on race or ethnicity, but it is definitely a topic that's front and center in the committee's work. So I'm going to step back to 2006 because what the university did then was we used our own internal capacity for research, and we actually contracted some researchers from our Department of Community Economic and Social Development to do a study on, it was a qualitative study based on, to study retention and satisfaction level of students from marginalized groups, including first-generation students, so students who are the first members of their immediate family to attend post-secondary, and also it included international students. So basically the research, the group conducted interviews with students, faculty, and staff. At the time we had a number of international students from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Ghana, just as a few examples of countries. And there were some interesting findings from the study. It revealed a real disparity between the university's informal position on culturally directed services and what is preferred by the diverse student body that we had. And I'm just going to speak a little bit about some of the findings and the recommendations from that study, because from listening to the conversations over the last couple of days, I think there are some parallels between those findings that could apply to newcomers in the wider community. So what the study found was it established a critical need, found that there was a critical need to establish contact and support early in the student's academic progression, so early on. And also to improve the internal communication about academic support services. So this all has to do with communication and making international students aware of the supports that are available to them early on. They recommended that we establish mechanisms for tracking the quality of the international student experience. There were a number of smaller recommendations that had to do with again, communication and understanding, things like creating an academic glossary to make sure that students from other countries understand the terminology that we're using. With respect to student orientation, including events that speak to diversity. And as a result of the study, we've done things, for example, now we've incorporated a powwow into some of our, it was in our Welcome Week for a while, now I believe they've changed when they have it. But we have been responding to that. The study also recommended partnerships with cultural organizations in the community and with our First Nation communities to make sure that university staff, not just the advisors, but any staff or faculty who are going to have contact with the international students, having a better awareness of what is out there in the community as far as referrals. Knowing about, for example, New to the Sioux or services that can help them, knowing where to send them. Another recommendation that came through strongly was sensitivity training for staff and faculty within the university, and I'm going to speak to this in a bit more detail shortly. Also, okay, I'll be fast. Okay, so I'm going to skip over the rest of the recommendations and speak very briefly to the successes and challenges, what has worked well since we did this study in 2006. And this is all anecdotal based on my experience as the chair of the committee. We haven't done another study, although we're working on starting one now to see how we're doing. So successes we've had, we have an English as a second language program on campus. That's been very, very successful. And it provides international students with a way to learn English on campus in an environment that hopefully they will then pursue degree studies, so they have an opportunity to become familiar with the environment. We've dedicated more support to international students. We have a dedicated advisor now, Director of International Student Recruitment, who is also responsible for organizing. We have a fairly extensive homestay program within the Sault Ste. Marie community, and that's been a great way for community members to learn about diverse cultures. Community engagement, we work with community groups, such as New to the Sioux, the Local Immigration Partnership, and the Labour Council to host events, and also to become more familiar with community supports for referrals. Another thing that's been really successful is providing forums to discuss diversity issues. And we try and make this community-wide. We've tried a number of different formats. We've tried traditional diversity training where you have someone come in and lecture for 3 hours. And we have found this not as successful as doing things like panel discussions, where we use the diversity that we already have to talk about the issues and some of the successes and challenges. And actually a couple of weeks ago we hosted our very first Community Diversity Symposium, and Vicki was the keynote speaker at that symposium. But we had 6 panels that consisted of students, community members who had hosted a homestay student, principals, teachers, community organizations, and so that was a really rich opportunity for the university to step forward and take a lead role in creating a welcoming community for international students and newcomers. Okay, I have to stop now. I'm just going to speak very, very briefly to 3 of the challenges. One is with perceptions, the community's understanding of diversity. And 2 really important things here that I want to point out. Being in a Northern Ontario community where we're not necessarily used to a lot of visible diversity, often if you have a student who is a visible minority and maybe Canadian from Toronto, they tend to be labeled in the SU as an international student, even though they're not international. And this labeling creates problems for students. And also assuming that international students want to have international-only events. I've run focus groups with international students, and what you hear from them are, well, we came to Canada to learn about Canada. We don't only want to have international sleigh rides, we want to have interaction with Canadians and Canadian students and really have that rich experience. Okay, and I'm just going to close with attitudes. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done in the communities with respect to attitudes and acceptance, and often it's students running into problems with frontline workers in the community, grocery stores, the mall. We've over the years consistently had feedback of students running into difficulty. You may have heard in the media about the unfortunate incident that happened on our campus in June, where we had an international student from Ghana and an Anishinaabe student from Garden River First Nation went to the mall, and when they returned from getting their smoothie, they were taken down at gunpoint in front of our campus by the police. And I'm not going to speak about the incident, but it's really interesting to see the community's reaction to that incident, because while we had many, many organizations who came out and actively supported the students and offered assistance in any way that they could, we were still hearing things like, well, if the student from Ghana doesn't feel comfortable in Sault Ste. Marie, then he should go back to Ghana. And so there's still a lot of work to be done with attitudes, and the university really hopes to play a lead role in working with the community to change that. So.
Hello, I'm Scott Fisher, the project coordinator for the Local Immigration Partnership Project in the City of Greater Sudbury, working within the Department of Economic Growth and Development. I'll speak a little bit about some of the challenges, approaches, elements, and information knowledge pertaining to the LIPS, Local Immigration Partnerships, and some of the experiences that we've had in Sudbury. But speaking with some of my colleagues, some of the experiences that they've had as well in terms of some of the challenges, some of the approaches that have worked, and so forth. One of the things, to start that conversation off with the challenges, and one of the challenges is this historical context with which the LIP is operating within. And I found, speaking with my colleagues, it's different from community to community, but that can pose quite a challenge to some communities. And it's something where there's a historical context, and it was talked a little bit earlier about the social, the services for new immigrants coming under a social context lens, and sometimes that history remains with even if it does change providers. And sometimes there is a challenge there in getting to work with economic development, or getting to work with employers, or getting to work with numbers people when that is sort of associated with that, still within that social context. The multifaceted approaches, overloading, or what I would call overloading with some of the organizations. And that's something we're experiencing with some of the organizations in Sudbury, where there are multifaceted, multi-programs, many different things that they will do and provide services for the general public. And the changes within the government funding in many different programs, Employment Ontario is one that comes to mind, that has not been an easy transition, has overloaded the staff, overloaded that human resource capacity, and has overloaded their ability at times to contribute to the best of the ability that they can, burning out, for lack of a better term. Some of the other things, funding mechanism, organizational culture, sometimes that is very difficult to change or very difficult to engage in. The organizational culture can be very rigid. It can be very much based upon eligibility criteria, be based upon very much the service that you're seeking. Sometimes there's the bouncing around between organizations that can happen if it doesn't fit within their mandate. So in terms of talking mainstream organizations, some of the mainstream organizations will follow along with that eligibility criteria, the rigidity of that, and may not provide additional services that maybe they could. And I love the creativity that I hear about with some of the other centers, and I think that's a great thing to be creative and innovative, to work outside of that rigid background that some of these organizations have come to know and has been sort of entrenched, that organizational culture that's been entrenched. So the silos that have been created over time, and there has been a concerted effort in many departments to break down the silos, and I keep hearing that, and I think there have been many very good approaches to do that, and many very good programs that will break down the silos, and I think that's on its way, but sometimes the culture of that remains, and it's the culture of that organizational silo that it's more difficult to crack. Some of the approaches that seem to hold promise, I think of three, and it's been talked about quite a bit, is the collaborating, connecting, and immersing. And the organizations, mainstream organizations, in collaboration with other organizations. I see the Local Immigration Partnership as an excellent vehicle for that, and I think it's worked very successfully, not just in Sudbury, but in all communities, in being able to bring many mainstream organizations together that would not have been together at the same table before, that would have worked on their own project and not involve other organizations that could have added to it, could have provided input to it, and maybe provided a better outcome at the end of it. So the collaboration, I think, is an excellent approach, and I think the LIP has been a main vehicle for that. I think it's been a great project for that. Connecting, the mainstream organizations, just connecting to other services, other providers. I think of the language instruction, for example. We have a LINK program, language instruction for newcomers. We also have non-link programs within the community. We also have post-secondary institutions that offer ESL classes. Well, they have come together as a group, and then they have planned and helped to provide opportunity for all ESL learners to come together for events so that they can learn from each other, that from the different contexts and different environments. Where before they would have operated in isolation from each other. The LINK would have run their LINK program. The post-secondary ESL program would have run their post-secondary ESL program. And so some of those approaches I think have helped greatly. Immersing, I think, is another thing. There's quite often mainstream organizations, again, there's a cultural change that needs to occur. And immersing in just learning, knowing, understanding, seeing. And the one example that I was speaking with someone about was there's a video by Triumph that probably many people have seen. I've seen it about 4 or 5 times now. It's a great video, but taking that and then showing that to the staff, to the actual people who will be delivering the services, the actual people who are part of the organization, and the actual people who are part of the culture, so that they are being exposed to some of these stories, to some of these more personal stories, and impact of those, I think is very beneficial. And again, in trying to impact the culture. It's one thing to read about it, to hear a guest speaker come up and talk about it for 3 or 4 hours, but when it's an impactful message such as that video to a staff meeting or staff training, I think that has much more resonance in assisting and changing the culture of the staff. Some of the elements elements, organizations, sectors that would need to be brought together, in my opinion, everybody. It's a newcomer, every aspect of life they touch and it touches them. So in an ideal world, it would be everybody, every organization and sector that would be existing, functioning within that community. But some of the more important ones, post-secondary institutions, I think are very important. Many post-secondary institutions are ramping up their international recruitment efforts. They're bringing more international students into the community. Whether the community is prepared for that increase is sometimes arguable, but it's a reality where the post-secondary institutions are actively increasing that population. So they're very important, not just universities, but colleges. In Sudbury, we have 2 colleges, a Francophone college and an Anglophone college, and they're very active in promoting, or they're very active in their recruitment activities at the moment as well. So there's the Francophone immigration component. Collège Boreal does active recruitment to prospective Francophone students. The education sector on the school board. The school boards, I think, are very, very important. Very important element to be involved in this process. The healthcare service providers, I think, are very important. It could be usually, at times, it can be a first point of access for newcomers, and I think they played a very important role in bringing the information and context to the wider group. Service provider organizations, housing sector, not just municipal housing, but also the private sector, realtors, for example. I think it's very important that that aspect is involved as well. Immigration portals, I think, play a very important part. Many communities now have an immigration portal. It can be a first point of contact and provide valuable information to someone that's new. And as I said, many other elements as well. Information and knowledge is needed. Really, there's the numbers, what's in it for me, being able to provide that sort of business case to some individuals, some organizations. There's that context that needs to be provided to many employers, economic development, but there's also the personal side of the personal side of it too, the personal stories. And that was mentioned before, earlier either today or yesterday, in terms of the general population, that the human side of it is something that's very, very good to let everybody else know about. The use of high context, low context messaging. Some cultures are high context, some cultures are low context. Taking that in consideration. Use of social media, it hasn't really been talked about, I don't think. And I think that's an excellent avenue to pursue, and would be something that I think should be used to more advantageously. And the quality of life, again, more on the softer side of it. So you have the numbers, what's in it for me, and then you also have the quality of life. So it speaks to both audiences. So,